A 911 call about a mental health crisis turns into a deadly police shooting. We've got some legal analysis for you. Stay tuned. This is attorney Andy Marcantel and attorney Emma Wittmann. We're from the Attorneys for Freedom law firm here today to talk about a pretty interesting video that has some people in the public up in arms. How are you doing today, Emma?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Fantastic. So I was thinking we could just start by watching the video together, and then maybe you can give some of the factual background. We'll dive right in.
All right, let's do it.
I should also mention the video we are about to play does involve a police-involved shooting. This woman is going to die on the video, so very graphic content coming your way. If that's not your cup of tea, definitely click away from the video right now.
Hey, is it you? You had a knife?
No, it's not me.
So who is it? Who's dealing with the issue? Who has that knife?
It's my sister.
Who's dealing with the mental health crisis? Who's having a nervous breakdown right now?
It's my sister. Yeah, Anya.
Who's the problem? Your sister or you?
My sister. I don't know where your sister is.
Wait, hold on. Don't. Stop. She has a knife. She's gonna hurt.
Don't come in this red line, please. Step back. Don't come in. Don't come in.
What's going on?
Yeah, we gotta put the dog in first.
All right, put the dog in. Let's go. We gotta go. Open the door. Open the door. Open the door, ma'am. You have the key? Open up the door, ma'am.
Is someone home?
Yes. Open the door. What else is with you? Dog and the. We have to go in.
Yeah.
I want to break the door down.
Go ahead, I'll stab you with your fucking knife.
Sir, do me a favor.
We don't want to shoot you.
Before
We want to talk to you.
So you're going to have to follow me, okay?
Alright, before we go on,
Go home,
can we
Dad.
go less lethal? Who wants to go less lethal? Who wants to go lethal?
I'll go lethal, okay?
David, yeah, David.
Alright, give me someone else not lethal.
We want to break the door down, ma'am.
He's getting the tools. If you're comfortable giving it a try, that's up to you. So they're, normally barricaded, we wait, but there's somewhere in there we need to go.
Yeah. Back off!
Open the door!
Drop the weapon!
We're gonna break the door! Drop the knife! Drop the knife!
Put the knife down! Put the knife down!
Put it down! What are you doing? What are you doing?
Where's the knife? Where's the knife?
Very disturbing and tragic incident there. Emma, why don't you give the listeners some background on how it came to this?
Yeah, so this actually occurred in Fort Lee, New Jersey, happened back on July 28th of this year, 2024. The brother that you see who first steps out of the apartment actually called 911 requesting for medical assistance for his sister. At that point, he let the 911 operator know she was having a mental health crisis. She suffers from bipolar and was having some type of medical episode that needed a response. 911 operator assured they could send somebody out there. However, police would also be responding. At that point in time, while we have not reviewed the 911 audio, it is reported that he did mention she had a utility or pocket knife in her hand, but was not threatening or using it towards anyone at that point. So at that point, call ends. Brother actually calls back into 911 and tries to cancel the call, but at that point, they let him know it's too late. Police are already on their way and they're going to be at your door shortly.
Yeah, he basically says something like, on second thought, we don't need any help. Everything's under control. And they say, sorry, sir, you just told us about a person having a mental health problem with a knife and causing problems, so we got to at least do a welfare check.
Absolutely. And so at that point, that's where we see the video pick up. Brother is obviously ready and stepping out of the door to let the officer know what's going on. Officer begins to open the door at that point. The door is not locked. You see the mom with the corgi standing in front of Victoria Lee. And Victoria Lee is the 25-year-old woman who the brother was calling in about. She was confirmed did have bipolar, and this was one of few mental health incidents that the family reports she's had, and they were calling for assistance with that. But she's the one in the back behind Mom and Corgi that actually tries to reach forward and shut the door.
Obviously, then the video starts rolling and they kick in the door. And we got a lot to say about how they handled it and what led to it and everything. But I think a good place right now to give a little disclaimer, which is we only have the information that's been given to the public so far, which is the things you just said plus the video that we just watched. And I think that's particularly relevant here because the Attorney General's office was called in to do an investigation in this case of the conduct here of the officers of the shooting to determine if there was some sort of a policy that was broken, but if there was some sort of a crime that was committed as well. And they've been reviewing it for months now. We're filming this in about mid-October of 2024. The shooting, as you mentioned, happened back in July. So that's a little bit irregular for the amount of time that it would take when you have a case of high public interest like this for them to make a charging decision. That leads me to believe that maybe there's something else going on. Maybe there's some other information. Maybe this woman was involved in previous calls, things of that nature, which may have been relevant to the, what the cops were thinking and the reasonableness of their conduct under the law. So I think it's really important to mention we don't have all the information, right? We never do. We just kind of get a snippet. But we're going to analyze this case the best we can with the information that we have. And I think the big burning question here is going to be, does this look like a good shoot or a bad shoot in terms of did this officer break the law by discharging that round and ultimately killing this young woman?
Yeah, I think that's important that you note here that we don't have all the information. What was said during that 911 call is really the only information the officer was equipped when showing up to that door, determining the urgency of the situation, the danger posed to himself, the other individual inside the apartment. So he's really basing any decisions he makes off of what information he was already supplied with, and then, of course, what happens in the very short amount of time he's actually at that door.
Yeah, let's start with an easy one, which is when the brother called back the second time and said, just kidding, don't send any officers, we've got everything under control. That whole thing that I just told you a few minutes ago about we're really concerned because she's having a mental health crisis and holding a knife, disregard all that. Nothing to see here, don't send anybody. Some people who look at this are going to say, well, that should have been the end of it then. The cops should have said, oh, okay, you don't need help anymore. We're going to go home. So whether or not that's the right decision, morally, the cops certainly legally had the right to do what's called a welfare check at that point. There's certain situations that if somebody, especially somebody with mental health problems, is potentially posing a risk, officers certainly have the right to at least go and check on that person. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they get to bust down your door absent any further evidence. It doesn't mean they get to walk in the front door of your house necessarily, but they at least get to go and investigate. And that's exactly what the officers did. And then in the course of that, they saw some additional information and heard some additional information that caused them to gain more evidence that a crime is being committed.
Yeah, exactly. And once he arrives, he obviously sees that Victoria was positioned behind Mom. At this point, we don't have a good visual, at least from the video. We don't know what the officer could see from his point of view exactly. But did she still have a knife in her hand at that point? Was he interpreting that as a hostage situation that was urgent, that gave him the ability to then make entrance to the apartment? And that's likely what his interpretation was in this case.
Yeah, that's another great point to reflect on here. You've heard us talk about a reasonable mistake of fact in terms of self-defense shootings. Whether or not this woman actually had a knife, what matters here in terms of the legality of the shooting is what did the officer reasonably believe? What would somebody in the officer's shoes reasonably believe? First of all, we had the family members themselves who, like her, who have no apparent reason to falsify a report like this, have now told officers that she has a knife. Then she says things to the officers very aggressively and hostile that also corroborate the fact that she has a knife, right? I'll stab you. You don't make that kind of a threat unless you have a knife and are able to carry it out. She also says some other things in the yelling exchange through the door that I think go to fortify the cops' reasonable belief that she was posing a very credible and dangerous threat if given an opportunity, which she says, not only will I stab you in the effing neck, but you can go ahead and shoot me if you want. want. So what she's communicating is, I'm going to stab you one way or another. You can shoot me if you want, but I'm going to stab you. So at that point, the officers clearly have a reasonable belief that she's armed, dangerous, and hostile and willing to attack them.
Absolutely. And I know this is a point of contention right now. The family is taking the position that she had put the knife down. She did not have the knife at the time that the officer made entrance into the apartment. But I know if you slow down the video, while it's not the most clear footage, it does appear there is something still in her hand. She has the water jug in one hand, which it looks like as she steps forward at the officer, she may start to throw. Her other arm is down by her side. It looks like mom might be grabbing that arm to hold it back, which again could be an indication that mom is trying to prevent additional harm from happening. And if you look at it closely, it definitely does look like she has a grip on something, and potentially a small blade might be coming out of her hand.
Yeah, when I slowed down the video and kind of did freeze frames on it, it sure looks like a knife to me. There is some sort of an object that's being held in that hand, and the way that she's holding it too looks like it's an extended blade. It looks like she's holding an extended blade to use it as a weapon, and mom is holding that arm with some urgency. So once again, with the reasonable mistake of fact doctrine here, what would a reasonable person in the officer's shoes who fired that shot, what would he think? And the answer seems pretty clear to me that this is a reasonable conclusion that she's armed with a knife. Given all the totality of the circumstances, the things out of her mouth, the reports from her family, I think the officer had definitely a reasonable belief at the time that that door was open and she kind of lunged at the officer, that she still had that knife. A couple of things here, because it's really important how you analyze the situation as an officer, depending upon whether the person is a similarly situated, reasonable person, just kind of an average person out there in the world, or whether they have mental health issues, because that can totally change the analysis, and I think it's worth spending some time on talking about this case.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there definitely could have been additional steps taken by the officer right at the outset that may have prevented this from happening. You know, separate from whether it was a good shoot or a bad shoot, was there other tools that the officer could have utilized to potentially de-escalate the situation? And in 2020, New Jersey, the Attorney General's office and DPS collectively put out a directive to all police departments. And that directive, amongst other things, laid out important steps that officers should be utilizing as part of their training when they're responding to calls specifically like this, where it's a mental health crisis. What can they do when they're on scene to first try to de-escalate the situation, try to calm that person down, take a little bit of time if they need to call in an expert to come in for negotiations, and what else can they do to try to prevent them from getting to a place where they have to utilize lethal force. And so in the directive, there's a couple different sections that I think would be important to highlight. So under the core principles 2.3, they talk about using force as a last resort. The officer shall exhaust all other reasonable means to gain compliance before resorting to force, if feasible. And this is where it becomes difficult, because we know if it's an emergency situation where the officer needs to get involved immediately, he may not have that time. And that's likely what the officer was thinking here is, we don't have time to utilize these tools. But this directive goes further than just focusing on when to use or not to utilize lethal force. And so if we take a look at the section that talks about mental health specifically, Section 2.7 of this directive talks about dealing with persons in a behavioral or mental health crisis. So it says officers should consider an individual's mental, physical, developmental, intellectual disability, or other conditions such as age of the suspect that affect the person's ability to communicate or comply. And then there's a list of A through M different factors, one of which being the behavioral or mental health crisis that a person may be going through. From there, it goes on to say that when an officer determines that one of the above criteria listed happens to be going on in this circumstance, they shall consider what other specific techniques or resources would be helpful to resolve the situation without needing to utilize force.
Right.
One of the points that they mention here is keeping a non-compliant person confined to a limited area, calling for a supervisor, backup officers, or a specifically trained resource to assist in resolving the incident. They also talk about officers being prepared with a less lethal device in that situation as well. So there's definitely circumstances here that the officer probably could have utilized and tools he could have utilized to try to de-escalate prior to breaking into the front door. Of course, watching it back later, we're looking at this in a much longer period of time where we have time to
Hindsight's
analyze.
20/20.
But one thing that stood out to me that they definitely could have done is tried to ask mom if mom was able to step outside, just like brother did. Brother came out voluntarily. Could the officer have said, is mom able to step out? Victoria, would you let mom go ahead and step out? And if both mom and brother were outside and it was just Victoria in the apartment, they would have had a bit more time to try to potentially reason with her or get in somebody else to speak to her through the door.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up mom, and I want to talk about mom in just a second, because in my opinion, her presence in that room totally changes my legal analysis here in terms of good shoot, bad shoot, did the cops act properly or not. But real quick, to say a word about the directives from the Attorney General's office and DPS in New Jersey. These directives are policies that they are instituting for police officers when they're dealing with these types of situations. But they're just that. They're policies. They are not the law. So it's not like there was a law passed that says now in all of these situations, cops are now mandated by law under penalty of punishment, some sort of a formal legal charge, if they don't follow all the directives in terms of dealing with people with mental health. And we're lawyers. Yes, it's important, and we consider whether an officer followed policy or didn't follow policy. But whether you get a disciplinary slap on the wrist from your police department is a different analysis than whether or not you committed a homicide, or whether or not you committed an aggravated assault, or whether or not the state can prove a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So I just wanted to mention that yeah, the directive is clearly trying to get officers in New Jersey to move more towards de-escalation, non-lethal, and everything like that. And you actually saw a brief conversation in the video, right? After, when all the backup shows up and they decide we got to enter that apartment, they have a little conversation amongst themselves. All right, so who's going to use lethal? Who's going to use non-lethal? And a few people call each one of those. The officer, who we can see their first-person view, takes out his firearm. Somebody else has that riot shield. Maybe there's some other people that we can't see in the video that are arming themselves with non-lethal but are away from the door. So it seems like if you put the guy with lethal right there by the door, that's going to be the force that's most likely to be used here. But to get to the subject of mom, yes, I understand that there's a strong argument that they could have engaged in some de-escalation with this person who was having a mental health breakdown, and in fact, that's what all the policies are trying to aim these officers towards doing. However, because mom was in the room, now we essentially have a hostage situation, in my view. When that door first opened, before she locked it behind her, and then they had to ultimately break it up, if you look at that image of her standing behind mom and mom holding that corgi, the corgi's freaking out, she looks scared. It looks like she may have the knife to her back at that point. It does not look like mom is safe at all. And yes, where possible, the officers need to use de-escalation for people who are experiencing mental health problems. But you could imagine the outrage the public would have if the officer said, yeah, well, it's true, mom's in there and she's potentially got a knife to mom right now, and let's just talk to her calmly and let's make everybody back up and we'll see if we can negotiate with her and maybe coddle a little bit in order to try to get her to calm down and come out voluntarily. And in the midst of that much longer process, she slits mom's neck or kills mom. Everybody would be outraged at the officers for not breaking down the door. So the fact that there is somebody in there who's potentially in imminent danger from a knife, I think that they get to break down that door. I think that they absolutely get to break down that door. Now, your point is an excellent one, which is, okay, why not try first? Ask her, how about you let mom come out here and we can talk, okay? Let mom, brother's out here with us. How about you let mom come on out and then we'll chat. Now the hostage has been removed from the situation. That buys them all the time that they need to try to talk her off the ledge, use de-escalation techniques and everything like that. So in my opinion, they definitely should have taken your suggestion there and at least attempted that. Because if she then says, no, screw you pigs, I ain't letting her out, or even worse, no, she's staying here with me, I got my knife on her, or something like that, now they instantly have a reason to go in. It's super urgent at that point. So they have all of the evidence that they need, that we need to be very, very swift here and free this person.
Yeah, one question could have made a huge difference in this case and given the officers some clarity as well.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to note that there was a very brief conversation amongst the officers that gives a sense of urgency. One of the officers mentioned someone's on their way up with tools in order to get into the apartment. However, there's someone else in there. We need to go now.
They were thinking the same thing I was. I said, well, normally it'd be nice to take our time and get the person up here who's trained with mental health expertise to talk to her through the door and see if we could do this, that, or the next thing, negotiate basically with her. But that officer had the same thought as me, which is we don't have time to do that. Normally we would be waiting, but there is a woman in there who is possibly at knife point who could die at any moment, so it's urgent.
Yeah, it's a really tough call that they had to make with the limited information they had and the short amount of time that they had. So it's easy for us to sit back and say what he could have done or other tools he could have utilized, but at that moment he had to decide based on the information he had and was provided prior to arriving what the best decision was going to be.
I agree. So door is now kicked open, and we can see in the video she doesn't start running right away. In fact, she's got a couple of different things in her hands. In her right hand, she's holding one of those large water jugs. And in her left hand, it sure looks to me like she's holding the knife, but at any rate, the officer can see she's holding something with her mom kind of urgently. It looks urgent to me, holding her hand down, trying to prevent her from using whatever is in her left hand. And so at that point, it looks like it looks like she's trying to throw the water jug at them. Does it look the same way to you?
Yeah, she takes a step forward almost into the doorway, and at the same time, it looks like the water bottle starts to come towards officers. And at that point, you also see the other arm down by her side, and it looks like mom has one or if not both hands holding that arm back with something gripped by Victoria. So yeah, it does look like she takes a step forward. I don't think she comes sprinting out of the apartment by any means, but almost more of a lunge to throw the water bottle.
Yeah, and I think that was interpreted by the officer as she's lunging to come at me with the knife, and the officer discharges one round. Relevant that it's one round. A lot of police shootings involve the officer basically emptying their magazine, and that's not what the law requires of police officers. They are allowed to use as much force as is reasonably necessary to end the threat, not execute somebody, not enact revenge, or not just pump them full of lead until there's no signs of life, because they administer aid, they attempt to administer aid afterwards, as they are trained to do. I would have loved to have seen, instead of the officer with a gun, somebody with non-lethal who's able to tase her or something like that instead of having to shoot her. And it sure seems like the policies instituted in 2020 in New Jersey seem to recommend that, or if not even mandate that. But once again, whether this officer violated a policy in his police department is a different question on whether he acted with a reasonable and proportionate amount of force to a reasonably perceived and imminent threat. And looking at it, I think it is, at worst, it's a close call for the officer here, but I don't think he gets charged. I think that this looks like this woman has now made multiple threats to stab him, and comes out holding some sort of an object with a quick motion, totally non-compliant with the officer. Like, at what point do we say officers get to shoot? This is a reasonable time where the officer gets to shoot. Do we really want to require an officer at this point, having been incredibly threatened with a totally non-compliant suspect who is, made threats to stab him in the neck and said, you go ahead and shoot me if you have to, but I'm going to stab you in the neck if you open this door. I think it's very reasonable for the officer to conclude that she was trying to make good on her threat at that point.
Yeah, it's an emotional video to watch. Obviously, you feel for the family. They were trying to get her medical help, and I'm sure they didn't want it to escalate this far. But when we're analyzing it, we have to separate the policy and what the officer could have done in the beginning to de-escalate. So like you said, was it a good shoot or a bad shoot? Was he justified? and could he be charged criminally. So it's important, even though emotions are involved when watching this video, to be able to separate out those two to get a good analysis on it.
Yeah, I know that the most recent news story about this was simply that the family was upset with the Attorney General's office at this point because it's taken so long for them to make a charging decision. And I certainly understand that. It can take a long time to make a charging decision in these cases. It's not super uncommon for it to take months. However, this is one that got a good amount of coverage, and the public eye has been on this one. Usually in a case of high public interest like this, as I said, they would make the decision quicker. So I understand the family's frustration, even if the answer is ultimately no charges, or we presented it to a grand jury and the grand jury said no charges. At least they can have the closure knowing what the result was, and they can move on. I don't know whether the family is pursuing a civil rights claim against either the officer or the department for bad training or something like that. As viewers of this show will know, that is a totally different analysis than whether or not the cop was allowed to shoot in self-defense and whether the officer committed a crime or acted in valid self-defense. That's a civil action, right? So it's a totally different burden of proof. But I think you looked into that, and it looked like the woman's estate, the family members, have not yet filed a civil rights claim.
I didn't see anything on it. It's possible that they have, but based on the information I saw, I didn't see any evidence of that.
Could be that they're just waiting to see what the AG does with the charges, or see if there's an indictment and then make a decision from there. But we're going to follow this one very closely. I am very curious to see what the result is going to be here, because it could very well be, okay, we're not going to charge him with a crime, but the dude just lost his job and there's going to be a huge civil rights claim against him and he'll never work as a cop again and they'll get a massive settlement against him. Or it could be he returns to work because this was a justified shooting and everybody decided in terms of the criminal liability and the civil liability, everybody decided that this officer acted as properly as he could under the circumstances, and so he returns to work. And this is an important thing, too. Officers are not required by the law to act perfectly. The law does not require or mandate perfection. The law mandates reasonableness. And so when you look at the totality of everything that was going on and that officer said, everything that he saw, everything that he heard, combined with the fact that we had somebody whose life was potentially in danger in there, the mom, I think the totality of the circumstances comes down that the officer acted reasonably here.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
But I hate to see a death like this when one was avoidable because, I don't know enough about New Jersey's policies other than what's in this mandate. But hopefully this is used as a training. Like maybe let's put the non-lethal person or somebody with non-lethal a little more towards the front or somewhere where they can act. Of course, tasing somebody doesn't have the instant effect of neutralizing the threat like a firearm does either. And so maybe that's what was going through their head. Okay, well, we can attempt to tase her, but last time we saw her in there before they kicked down the door, she was basically holding the mom in front of her like a human shield. So, yeah, lots of, hindsight is 20/20 going on here. But with the cards that were dealt here and the facts that we are aware of, I'm going to conclude that I think this guy doesn't get charged.
Yeah, I agree.
Even in a jurisdiction as unfriendly to guns and even police, largely, as New Jersey. So we're going to keep a very close eye on this one. Thank you guys very much for tuning in today. Go and check out attorneysonretainer.us to learn all about our self-defense program and what it can do for you. Also check out attorneysforfreedom.com to learn all about our law firm and how we represent people. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to throw a like on it, leave us a comment down below, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, this has been Attorney Andy Marcantel and Attorney Emma Wittmann signing out. Peace.